We'll come back to Bruce Almighty in a little bit. We've been in a series called Return on Investment, and of course at camp, the theme of camp was weird. I'll let you know, we had no idea that either of those two terms would be political buzzwords in this political season, that weird and return on investment would be used by the candidates continuously throughout the whole campaign. That is totally coincidental. We plan these things out months in advance. It just happens to come up. And if you have no idea how those things intersect with the current campaigns, well, God bless you, bless your heart that you're not all wrapped up in the craziness and the ridiculousness of the political season. So that's good on you for that. Don't even worry about going out to Google it. Last week we left off looking at a parable that Jesus tells when he's on his way to Jerusalem. He's on his way to Jerusalem for the final time, to knowing full well that they seek to arrest him because he's going there to give up his life as a ransom on the cross. And so he is on his way from Galilee, which is up in the northeastern part of the nation of Israel. So he's traveling down the Jordan River Valley. The last city he comes to is Jericho, and that's the turning point where you would then head east up into, you would then head west up into the hills towards Jerusalem from Jericho. And so he tells this parable last week, which really he was pulling from a story from when Herod went away to solidify his own political power. Then he came back and he says, your life, your relationship with me is going to be like those who were trying to be faithful to the king before he came back, because I'm going to be going away for a while, and it's going to be a while before I come back. So the things that you do, the return on investment that you're looking forward to, shouldn't be in the near term, but you should be thinking long term down the road. And you shouldn't just be thinking about yourselves, but about other people in the process. And so that parable was over in Luke chapter 19. And I mentioned last week that most everything in the book of Luke pretty much follows a chronological order, whereas the other narratives about Jesus' life from Matthew, Mark, and John are not typically arranged chronologically. The only exception is all of the accounts, when it comes to the final week of Jesus' life, they put all of those accounts are all towards the end of each of the four narratives. And so when you go over to Matthew, Luke, and John, they get somewhat chronological towards the last week of Jesus' life. And so we see part of that over in the book of Matthew. And so I want to flip over to Matthew because he picks up right where we left off last week, coming out of Jericho. Because in Matthew chapter 20, verse 29, it says, as they were leaving Jericho, this is what happened. So he's there in Jericho, about to leave Jericho to head to Jerusalem to head towards Easter week. And so as he's leaving Jericho, right after he's told this parable about, hey, I know you guys are thinking that this is going to be a short-term endeavor, that you guys have been working really hard for the past couple of years and the payoff's coming next week. I'm trying to let you know that's not the plan. That's not how it's going to go down. You need to be shifting your focus in terms of this return on investment or how we're going to get there. And it's right in that same context that another story comes up. If you've been in church for a long time, you may be familiar with this story. Others, you may be hearing it for the first time. What ends up happening, the disciples are all focused on who's going to be the greatest, and when Jesus goes in and he overthrows the political establishment and the religious establishment of the current day there in Israel, that Jesus is going to come out on top, and they're going to have the primary cabinet positions, kind of like right now. You kind of wonder, as one person endorses another person in the political season, what's he have to gain out of this? Will he be Secretary of State? Will she end up becoming Department of the Interior? What do they have to gain? Because that's kind of the way our modern politics work. And the disciples are thinking in the same way. You know, am I going to be VP? Am I going to be Secretary of State? Am I going to be a Secretary of Defense? Am I going to be the chief priest when this all goes down? And so we see another picture of this in Matthew chapter 20, right in the same setting. If you go back up to verse 20, in Matthew chapter 20, verse 20, that's where we see that two of the disciples, their mama comes and pulls Jesus aside and says, hey, Jesus, I know Peter, James, and John are really close to you, but I want my boys, James and John, to be the top two. Can one of them be sort of the head, the Secretary of State, and the other one be the chief priest when you come into your kingdom? Can they be at your right and at your left? And Jesus says, woman, you don't really know what you're asking. It really doesn't play out like that. If you had just listened to my last story, or if you listened to the countless times that I've told you that's not the plan or the program, you would know that's not where this is headed. And the other disciples, of course, get wind of it because they're all thinking the same thing. And that's where he then turns to them. I'm just going to pick up in verse 24. He says, when the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers, of course, and their mama. They're all upset because not because they were thinking it, but because they outmaneuvered them, so to speak. And Jesus calls them together and says, listen, you guys know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. With their high officials, how they exercise their authority. In other words, they use their power to seek out their own purposes. He says, but not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must become your servant. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. What Jesus is trying to do, and what he ends up doing with his life, is revolutionary in religious circles. In other words, up until this time, if you go through any ancient religion, and even if you trace religions that have popped up on the scene after Jesus that are outside of the Christian tradition, and I would even say, even among Christian religions that fail to, I'm not really sure how I would say this, who sort of lost sight of who Jesus was, or I would even maybe say, they were as misguided as who Jesus was or what his purposes were as the disciples were in this moment. So the disciples are all thinking about me and mine and being the greatest, and what do I have to do to sort of get the right position? Jesus trying to correct that and change that. Now, there are Christian traditions and religions that continue to still miss the mark on that, and they then become just like every other world religion. And what I mean by that is, with every religious system, universally outside of Jesus and what he's trying to do here, if you wanted to show that you were the most committed or most pious or most devoted, if you wanted to be seen as a godly person, the question is, what would you do? Well, if you were devoted, you would do something like, there'd be some issue of self-denial or self-sacrifice in a way. So the Greeks, they would call these the ascetics, those who would beat their body or put themselves towards personal torture or submission. Even within some Christian traditions and others, we talk about fasting, that you would go without and do without just to show your devotion to God. And if you were to see somebody who had done when I say 40-day fast, I'm not talking where you gave up chocolate for Lent. I mean like really fasting where you don't eat anything, either sun up to sundown, or you go 40 days with nothing but water, or that kind of. If you were to see somebody do that, your thought would probably be, oh, wow, they are really devoted. They are a really strong believer. And it doesn't matter whether you are in Christian circles or any other circles, if you saw somebody do that kind of thing, then they came across as very devout, right? Or in other times, you see some other people, what they would do to show their devotion to God is it would be in some form of giving. Back in the olden days, it'd be somebody who brings the largest animal to the sacrifice, and everybody looks and goes, oh, wow, did you see what Tom brought? Tom brought the biggest calf to the sacrifice. You can tell he really loves God. Or in modern times, it means you gave so much that your name's on the building. Maybe even the religious building, the place where everybody gathers for worship is even named after you or after your family in some way, shape, or form. Or maybe all of the bricks leading up to the worship center are all named after you, and each one has a family member's name on it because you gave so much, and you look at that and go, wow, they must be really devout, really pious because of what they've given. Or for others, it's a strict adherence to the legal code of that religion. So because you follow every single rule to the T, you are the highest example of that which is devout. And that was true back in the ancient times where you had different priests, or you had Pharisees, or even, as you move through history with the Shiites or the shamans or the Brahmins, or the Baptists, whatever you want to call them, they're just known because of how dedicated they are to their faith and how they are so legalistic even down to the most minute things. Like I remember a friend of mine, we all saw him as like the most spiritual guy in the church ministry group because he would not go see rated R movies. It was just, he was so, when you're in college scene, that's kind of an odd thing. And then when Passion of Christ came out, we all basically were watching to waiting to see what he would do. Is he going to go and, he was so devoted to God, he would not see the Passion of the Christ because it was rated R. That's impressive, isn't it? Misguided, maybe, but I don't know if I'd say impressive. But that's really where this goes, is we get to the point, and we still think that way. Even in Christian circles, when you see somebody who is doing something that's sort of, an ultimate example of self-denial or of sacrificial giving or of legalistically adhering to the highest of moral codes, we look at that person and say, well, if there's anybody who is devoted and dedicated, if there's anybody who is a strong believer of the faith, whatever the faith is, those are the marks of it. And what Jesus was seeking to do, and what Jesus has done for those who truly grasp who he was, is he changed the metric from devotion of denial or of sacrifice to one of serving. To be great, to be seen as great, the greatest in the kingdom of God, the metric that should be used is who is the one who is the greatest servant of all? Who is the one who no job is beneath them, that serving is just sort of their mindset and who they are and how they see themselves with you? Because he says to them, not so with you. It shouldn't be like that with you. When it comes to showing your extreme devotion, it shouldn't be like that with you. It shouldn't be like that with you like it is in every other faith. With you, it should be the one who seeks to be the greatest servant. That is the one you should look at and say, I don't know of anybody more Christ-like than fill in the blank. Why? Because of how much they serve. I mean, there's just no job beneath them. They just are willing to serve and care for anyone. But, of course, as the narrative goes on, the disciples don't get it. They're continuing to jockey for position in the same way that the church doesn't get it. That we still struggle to this day to think of somebody who is extremely devoted to God. We still look to those same markers. We're still not looking to that who is the greatest of servants. And so when you then get to the Last Supper, that's where it says in John 13, so Jesus is now gathered together with his disciples. He knows they're still arguing and talking about who's the greatest. This hasn't stopped since Jericho. In other words, they argued about this from the time they left Jericho, even with those conversations, for the couple of days' journey it took to get up to the outskirts of Jerusalem, and then for the entire final week that Jesus is there ministering in Jerusalem, this is what they're still focused on. And so now here he is at the Last Supper, the last time he's going to meet with them, and it's still on their minds. And so it says this in John 13. And so Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power. So before we get anything else, I just want to focus on that for a second. It says in this moment, this is where Jesus is given absolute power, 100% full authority and power. Now, typically when we talk about absolute power, there's a saying we all know pretty well, and that is power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's close to the truth. The reality is power reveals. Power reveals, and absolute power reveals absolutely or thoroughly. That the greater power you have, the more it reveals who you are. And the reality is each one of us is corrupt deep down. And so when we have absolute power, what do? It just exposes our own corruption. I mean, the words political corruption almost are synonymous, are they not? Corrupt politicians are almost synonymous. And it really doesn't matter who you vote for in this election. They're both going to first and foremost look out for themselves, for those who are their private donors. And then if there's some way, shape, or form that it would help out you or for their own ends in the future, then they'll look to you or care about you. It doesn't matter who you look to in this situation. They all care about themselves. Is that a fair statement? And because they all care about themselves, if we have absolute power, I guess that's where I go to the Bruce Almighty clip. Now, if you notice, you probably noticed from last week, especially if you were in first service, I cut a lot of things in the videos. I missed a cut last week on the first service. We corrected it. But I have to cut a lot of things out of the video. I had to cut several things out of the video here because the thing that Bruce does, once God gives him absolute power, he does a lot of things I can't show on Sunday morning. And I would say it'd be fair to say that if you were given absolute power, would it be fair to say there's probably some things that you would do that I probably also would not want to show on Sunday morning? Is that a fair statement? And which is why when politicians have absolute power, is it a fair statement to say that they use a lot of that power to cover up the things that they're doing with their absolute power, right? So, right, synonymous with political corruption is a political cover-up, right? They all kind of go hand in hand because that's just who we are. It reveals the essence and the nature of who we are and the things that we would do. I mean, after all, if you were given absolute power, what would you do with it? Somebody cuts you off in traffic? Gone, done. Earth would be better off without them, wouldn't they? Wouldn't it? Boyfriend breaks up with you. The earth would be better off without him anyway, right? You will never do that to me or anybody else. I have absolute power. I can just take him out, and then I'll take him out, and then I'll take him out, right? We'll just keep on going down the list. How long would marriage last? How many women would you have been married to by now if you had absolute power and you could just cycle through them? I mean, Henry VIII, I think, went through 8 of them, right? Or whichever one he was, I don't know. Right? If you have absolute power, you would go through at a rapid pace. And to some extent, we can often look at it and say, think about your finances, if you will. Your finances is your financial power. What do you use your financial power for? Most importantly, us. That's the old adage of, if you were to win the lottery, what would you do with it? And save your whole "I would give it all to charity" speech. The reality is, the top 10 of your list is going to begin with me and my. It's either something for me or something for my kids or my parents or it's all going to have, there's going to be a very close connection to me with the top 10 on that list. Why? Because it just shows power doesn't corrupt, it just reveals the corruption that's within us. What power does is it reveals who we truly are at our core. So, it says here that Jesus is given absolute power. Now, you might say, well, he's always had power, hasn't he? No. If you've read through the scriptures, you would know that it's not until this moment that he's given all power. You might say, but what about all the stuff he's been doing? It seems like he's got all kinds of power. He can speak to the winds and the waves and get them to stop at his command. If you listen to what Jesus says, he says, I can do how much? All or nothing. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Paul says that later on, but Jesus says, I can do nothing apart from the Father. In other words, if I want to do anything, I got to ask Daddy. Daddy has the power, and I just go and ask him. That's like sometimes I said, listen, son, you are not rich. Your daddy, by comparison, is. If you want something, you ask me. And that's where we have issues with, why is it there's still all these restrictions on my stuff? I'm a full-grown adult now. Great. Let me send you the bill, right? You don't have the power and the authority you think you do. It's still all flowing through me. Everything you have is still flowing through me. Someday you'll be an independent adult, but that's not right now. Up until this point, everything Jesus has done, when he has walked on water, when he has healed the blind, when he spoke to the tomb and Lazarus came forth, all of that was God's power being expressed through Jesus Christ. Paul says it this way over in Philippians chapter 2, that when Jesus came down to the earth, when he became the incarnate human, he emptied himself of all of his divine powers. He emptied himself and became just like you and me. That he emptied himself of all that power. Now here he is at the Last Supper, and God now indwells him with all power. It's at this point that he is fully indwelled with all power. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So it says he's now given all power. It says, for Jesus knew the Father had put all things under his power, and he had came from God and was returning to God. In other words, he says he knows who he is and the power that he has. This is like the plot of every Marvel Origins movie, isn't it? Where they're going and they discover who they are and the power that they have. And whenever they discover who they are and the power that they have, it is time to go fight crime in the name of all that is good and right in the world, right? I mean, Spider-Man, it ends with, who am I? I am Spider-Man, right? And he becomes the crime fighter, and he uses all of his powers for good because he knows that with great power comes great responsibility, and so he goes to seek to use all of his powers for the good of humanity. Or there's that time when Thor forgets who he is and the power that he has, right? And he just becomes indulgent and morbidly obese out there in obscurity, right? Isn't that like everybody's favorite Thor, though? Because he's a little more identifiable in that moment. Like, yeah, even Thor looks like me, right? But what's the whole purpose of that whole movie? It's that Thor needs to remember who he is. And when he remembers who he is and the power that he has, what happens? It's time to go seek out vengeance in the name of all that is good, and your enemies better watch out once you have all power and you know who you are, right? So what happens with Jesus when Jesus knows who he is and has all power? Is this where he goes and kicks butt and takes names? No, it says that, and so, with all power, he does what power does. Power reveals who we truly are. And it says he takes off his outer garment and puts a towel around his waist, pours water in the basin, and he goes and he does the humblest, most servitudinal, if that's a word, the greatest, the lowest form of service you could possibly do in that culture was to be the guy who washes all of the stuff off your feet, because as you've been walking on the road, you're collecting dust and every kind of animal dropping that's on the road, and you're the one who would go down and wash all of that off everybody else's feet. And the thing that we might overlook in this moment is it didn't bother Jesus to do this. Like it wasn't out of the ordinary for him. It wasn't like, and Jesus humbled himself. That's how I've even taught that or even thought that. Well, in this moment, what Jesus did is he humbled himself and he washed their feet. No, Jesus humbling himself was when he became incarnate. Paul says when he was born in the Christmas pageant there in the manger, that was when he humbled himself. And from there on, that was just his current state on the earth. He was in that humbled state. And so he did not humble himself to take on the nature of a servant to wash everybody else's feet. That's just who he was. That was his nature. His very nature was that of a servant. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes when we try to do something Christ-like, there's something in the back of our mind which says, well, I will do this, but this is still beneath me. You follow me on this? So for instance, if I were to ask you to go do something this week, give you an assignment, I've done this in the past, give you an assignment to go do something that is Christ-like and show that kind of service, you would do it, but in the back of your mind, there'd be this registering thought that, well, this is beneath me, so this would be a good thing to show how Christ-like I am in this moment. So let's just say that you are at a party, just a party, maybe even only know the person who's hosting it, and you go and you notice the bathroom is gross and disgusting, and so you decide you're going to clean the bathroom for the person. Ever done that? And if you did it, you would be thinking to yourself, this is not my job, but I'm going to do it just because I'm going to do the Christ-like thing right here, right? I'm going to do it. Or how about at home? Everybody's got chores. Everybody has a role, whether it's defined or undefined. Everybody knows there's things that you do, things that I do, things that are my brother's job, things that are my sister's job, things that are my wife's job. Or we all have things, it's my job, your job, right? We all kind of have that. Well, because I'm going to be Christ-like, I am going to fold the laundry for you, right? It's not my job. You're the one who takes out the trash, but I will do it, because I love you and I'm going to be Christ-like today. And so I will do your thing. We still have the mindset that it's not my job, that I'm doing it for somebody else. Or what if you were to clean the microwave out at your office? Some of you have that microwave at your office. And if you were to clean it out, and if you were to do it just simply because that's the kind of thing Jesus would do, is it fair to say that you'd want everybody in the office to know who cleaned it out? Is it a possibility that you would then become the office kitchen Nazi at your work? That you would make sure everybody knows they need to keep the microwave clean because of how disgusting and gross it was? And when you see Janice's name on some spaghetti in the office fridge, you're going to go back later that day to check to make sure that Janice didn't leave spaghetti sauce all over the top of the fridge, right? Because even when we serve, we still struggle to have the mindset that Christ had because it's beneath us. It wasn't my job. And because it wasn't my job, you're going to know about it. You're going to hear about it. I'm going to make sure you know it's not my job. And I did this only because I'm just trying to prove how Christ-like I am or how holy I am or I want you to know how good I am or there's something I need to get out of it for me. That wasn't the mind of Jesus. It wasn't beneath him to serve. It's who he was. Because when you have absolute power, it reveals who you are at your core. Who you are at your essence comes out and flows out of you when you have all power, all authority to do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. And what did he want to do? He wanted to get up from the table and serve. The lowest of the lowest position. It wasn't beneath him, it's who he was. It's what he was. He was a servant. Now, the other thing I find interesting about the story is if you look at the narrative, here in John 13 is where Jesus is given all power. And none of the miracles that we associate with Jesus doing miracles happen after this point. Okay, like all the stuff where he walks on water and he calms the wind and the waves and calls Lazarus out of the tomb and heals the blind, the sick, and the lame, all that kind of none of that stuff happens after this point. The only real miracle that happens, and I'm going to call it a miracle in the sense of how we typically use the word, not how we typically use the word in terms of Jesus. Like when Jesus does something, it's usually something absolutely supernatural that, only God divine working power through humanity could do it. The miraculous thing Jesus does is an extension of what happens here. He takes on the lowest position, and then Paul would describe it this way over in Philippians 2. It says, he made himself nothing, taking on the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, not being found in the appearance of man, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross. The only miracle that happens after this is, I call it miraculous because Both the Jews and the Greeks of the ancient world could not wrap their mind around how this could even happen. How is it that humanity is able to overcome or overpower God? If he's God, how could he allow himself to be killed? If he has all power, all authority, how could he be crucified on a cross like that? That doesn't make any sense. It would take a miracle for that to happen, in a sense. If that were truly God, that just doesn't line up with everything that we know about what it means to be deity. And that's because everything you know about deity all comes as an expression of who you are, not who God is. For instance, even within Christianity, we love singing worship songs about God's majesty and his power and his might, how he's King of kings and Lord of lords. Rarely do we sing about him being the greatest servant. Why? I think it's because we admire the parts that we aspire to, right? We admire the fact that he is all-powerful, almighty, King of kings, Lord of lords. And we admire that so much more than we do sometimes the Jesus, you're the greatest servant. Make me a toilet cleaner like you. It doesn't rhyme, and it doesn't really sound like it'd be a good worship song, right? Let me be lower. Let me be humiliated. Put everybody else in front of me. I want to go last. I want to be a friend to the person who has no friends. That's what I want. Praise Jesus, 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 who did all of that. That's not a worship song, right? It doesn't ring with us because we still struggle to grasp who Jesus was. He was ultimately a servant. And he humbled himself in becoming like humanity. And he was the humblest of all humanity because he gave himself up for you and for me. And so I'll finish out with just this last thought. So what is the return on investment for serving? Well, two things. One is, Jesus says it will be worth it. Whatever you've done in my name, it will be worth it. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Whether down here, moth and rust will destroy whatever you have. Up there, you'll receive a reward, which you cannot quantify, which you would be beyond your wildest dreams. So there is a reward there. But is it also fair to say that there's a reward here that you don't even expect? How many times have you heard somebody say, I went and I helped, and I feel as though it changed me more than it helped them? It has its own rewards. Becoming more like Christ has its own return on investment. Becoming more like who God created you to be puts you in a place of wholeness. And if you're seeking some sense of shalom, or I just need to find who I truly am, I need to go find myself, who you truly are is a child of God created to be like God. And the closer you become to who God made you to be, a humble servant, the more you will find yourself. Which is why people say, I find so much more happiness when I'm helping others. It's more blessed to give than receive. All those cliches have a truth behind them. And the truth behind them is this is who you were made and created to be. You will never be more like God than when you serve. What's incredible about God is not that he's more powerful than us, but that he's a greater servant than any of us. The fact that he came to serve and not to be served. And yet there's still an aspect, though, that feels as though the closer we are to God, the more God should be serving us. When in reality, the closer we are to God, the more we should be like him in serving others. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your grace over us that I'm in no position to judge any of the disciples who were seeking to be the greatest by all these different methods because, Father, the honest reality is each one of us has a piece of that in our heart too. Every one of us has jobs in this room that we would say is beneath us. And yet in your time and your culture, you took on the lowest of jobs, the most looked down upon position. And it was so seamlessly and effortlessly and naturally who you were. So, Father, may we seek to be like you, to follow after you. to prove our love, devotion, and service to you by serving like you. And in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.